Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rukmini Callimachi, and I'm a journalist for the New York Times. I cover ISIS and Al-Qaeda for the Times, and I'm here today to discuss with you the pattern that we've seen in San Bernardino, where 14 people were shot by an ISIS-linked couple, now in Orlando, and then today in a small community just outside of Paris. What is important to see here is that ISIS has set out a protocol for how actors in the West, so-called lone wolves, are to take credit for these attacks. So starting with San Bernardino, we saw that the couple, before they left for the attack at the community center, posted on Facebook their pledge of allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who is the leader of the Islamic State. Fast forward to Orlando, we see that he did this in a 911 call to the police. And just last night, in yet another tragedy, a young man, a 25-year-old, who had suspected ties to the Islamic State, went and hunted down a police officer, killing him by stabbing him outside his home, and then entered his home and killed his girlfriend or companion in the presence of their 3-year-old child. Before the police arrived, the gunman was able to upload a video using this very technology that we're using right now called Facebook Live. And in that Facebook Live, he specifically said, "I am pledging allegiance to Amir al-Mu'minin," which is the honorific title for the leader of ISIS. It means the Emir of the believers. "I am pledging allegiance to Amir al-Mu'minin Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi." And he further went on to reference the speech by Adnani, who is the spokesman of ISIS, and who called for an increase in attacks during the holy month of Ramadan, which began last week. So I am here to take your questions. I think there's a lot to discuss, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Again, I'm here to take your questions, so if any of you have questions that you'd like to post, please go ahead and let me know, and I'll take them from here. Brian has the question of why Ramadan. That's a very good question. Ramadan is, of course, considered the holiest month for Muslims. It's normally a time of purification and a moment in time when Muslims around the world fast during the daylight hours and are focused on prayer and drawing closer to God. Because the jihadists believe that their mission, these acts of violence, are, in their view, acts that are godly, this is a very important time for them. And ISIS, just like Al-Qaeda, has asked for an increase in attacks during the month of Ramadan. And we've seen that happen both this year and last, and we've also seen it with Al-Qaeda in years past. Amanda Benavides has a question on whether we have any leads on further attacks. Here in Paris, we're in the midst of Euro 2016, which is a major soccer competition. And several ISIS suspects that were arrested starting with the November 13th attacks had named Euro 2016 as one of the targets. In fact, one of the people who was arrested after Brussels said that the Brussels attack was in fact precipitated by the fact that one of their collaborators was arrested, and that the real target was the soccer match. In the video that this young man outside of Paris uploaded last night, one of the things he says is he looks at the camera and smiles with this eerie smile and says that they're going to turn Euro 2016 into a cemetery. Obviously, this is a threat. I don't know that authorities have any real leads on anything specific, but here in France, Euro 2016 is a jittery time. Mohammed has an interesting question about what makes us believe that there is a link between ISIS and the Orlando killings. I wanted to stop and talk for a second about the concept of the lone wolf and what role it plays both in Al-Qaeda and in ISIS. Years and years ago, before, I would say, before 2010, I can't remember the exact date, Al-Qaeda had fallen into a slump, and they hadn't had a major attack in a while. And they began thinking about what they could do to basically re-energize the organization. One of their commanders, whose name is Yunus al-Mauritani, and who ended up being arrested in Pakistan by local forces and then handed over to US soldiers, he wrote a white paper called Future Works. And in this white paper, he argues to his colleagues in Al-Qaeda that the organization was going to fall into disrepute and become irrelevant if they didn't find a way to do attacks more quickly, because the attacks that they had been planning up until that point, like the embassy bombings in East Africa, like 9/11, like the USS Cole, were all attacks that took a long time to mount. And he came up with this idea that why don't we see if we can use our propaganda through the media, and by that they mean the media that they control. Can we use our propaganda to essentially incite people who are our supporters in faraway places? Can we incite them to carry out acts of violence in our name? It's with this idea that Al-Qaeda then began Inspire magazine. And Inspire magazine became a kind of do-it-yourself for jihadists all over the world. It had bomb recipes, it had ideas for targets that one can hit. It talked about encryption and the types of tools that one can use to protect oneself from law enforcement. The thing is that Al-Qaeda was never particularly successful in inciting lone wolf attacks. Perhaps the most successful such attack was the Boston bombings with the Tsarnaev brothers. By contrast, ISIS picks up this idea in 2014, at the same time when they declared a caliphate. And in practically every speech that the spokesman of ISIS has put out, there is always a heavy focus on trying to incite their followers in the West to pick up the mantle and carry out acts of terror in their name. Just about the only requirement that they've put out is that the shooter or the attacker needs to pledge allegiance to the group at some point before or during the attack. And so, for example, in January of 2015, an attacker called Amadi Coulibaly, who initially was believed to be linked to the same people that did the Charlie Hebdo shooting here, he took hostage a supermarket, a kosher supermarket in Paris. And during that attack, he was actually able to call reporters on the phone using the phones that were in the supermarket and clearly tell them that he was doing the attack on behalf of the Islamic State. I was in Paris when that attack was ongoing, and there was a lot of skepticism at that point as to whether this guy really was working for the Islamic State. What's emerged since then is that he had contacts with people in Syria, and authorities now do believe that he was linked to ISIS. The question is always, how tightly are they linked? I think, however, that question has started to miss the point. And I say that because the line between attacks that are carried out by ISIS operatives themselves and the ones that are being carried out by the people that they inspire has been blurred for a long time now by the fact that ISIS is, by design, putting out propaganda and reaching out to unstable young men all over the world with the aim of trying to get them to do this very thing. So I've had sources tell me that they actually have people in Raqqa who are dedicated to nothing but sitting behind a computer and trying to troll the internet and reach out to people who are drawn to their ideology. When you see somebody pledging allegiance in this very specific way, as we saw in San Bernardino, as we saw in Orlando, and as we're seeing last night in this suburb of Paris, when they're using this very typical language, which is, I pledge allegiance to Amir al-Mu'minin, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the Caliph of the Islamic State. you can't say for sure, did they have contacts with actual ISIS members, but I think you can say with some certainty that they've at least imbibed their propaganda, and therefore that link is established. Let's see, we have some more questions here. David Jones has a very interesting and intelligent question. He says, it seems that ISIS isn't directly managing some of their attackers, maybe only claiming connections after the fact. Could what seems to be a hands-off management style be partly a strategy to stay off law enforcement's radar? And the answer is absolutely. When Al-Qaeda came up with the idea of the lone wolf concept, part of it was to create a steady rhythm of smaller attacks that would essentially, steal the media spotlight in between the many months that it took them to mount their bigger attacks. So that was point number one. But point number two is the fact that these people were inspired almost uniquely through propaganda would mean that there was no connective tissue back to the group. And therefore, it would help to keep the group safe and their core members safe, even as they continued to extend their mission of terror and create these ghastly acts in the rest of the world. So, David, you're absolutely right. One of the reasons for this is to stay off of law enforcement's radar. Let's see, we have some more questions. Sheena Hayes has a question about whether there's any speculation as to why this particular young man targeted this particular police officer in Paris. I'm in the Paris bureau right now, and my colleague Alyssa Rubin is just in the next room, and she's been working on this story all day. And this is really the question that we've been trying to answer, and we haven't been able to answer it. I spent some time this afternoon in the small village where this occurred. It's called Mengnonville. It's about 40 kilometers north of Paris, and I walked up and down the street where this officer was killed. And what was interesting is the neighbors all said to me that they did not know that he was a police officer. So this attacker managed to figure out something about a law enforcement official that his own neighbors did not know. That shows some level of pre-planning. I don't know if, did he follow him home from the police station and therefore figure out that this is where he lives, or was he staking out the place for some time? But he clearly knew something that people living in close proximity to this man did not know. So that suggests some level of planning. Let's see. Theo Kutsafatis, I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name, is asking the following question. He says, Omar Mateen seems to have specifically targeted an LGBT club. Are LGBT people viewed as premier targets in the eyes of ISIS propaganda, being both culprits of non-believers and LGBT, or was his choice of target motivated by his own personal hatred? Again, that's a really smart question. And this is really a chicken versus egg sort of problem. I don't think any of us know. Did the Orlando shooter choose that target because of his own hatred of gay people? Or was he an extremist in his Muslim views, and as part of that extremism, he also imbibed a hatred of homosexuals? I don't know which one came first, and I'm not sure that we'll ever know. But one thing is clear, which is that if you have a hatred of gay people, ISIS is a group that does cater to that hatred. This is a group that has been throwing people that are accused of being gay or lesbian off of buildings in Syria. They have posted graphic and awful images of people being tied up and being thrown off of these buildings for the crime of being homosexual. So my point, I guess, is it could be that the two are intertwined and that it's not one or the other. Marissa and Robert have questions here. I'm going to start with Robert Donahue. He asks, are there countries where ISIS's lone wolf strategy has been effectively countered? e.g. by prior arrests? Are there countries which are getting it right? I would venture to say that America is one of the more successful examples. We've had only 3 of these so-called lone wolf attacks, starting with so Orlando this weekend, San Bernardino last December, and then before that, in May of 2015, 2 young men drove to a community center in Garland, Texas, and tried to open fire on a Prophet Muhammad cartoon competition. Those are the only 3 that I am aware of, and that is far, far less than a country like France, which is on the one hand much smaller than America, and which has had probably a dozen or so by now. So what is America doing? I mean, on the one hand, there's been a lot of critique of the way the FBI has very aggressively pursued some of these ISIS suspects, going so far as to create informants who are posing as Muslims and who attempt to get the suspect to commit to an act of terror. In one case that I read about, they actually, encouraged this young man to go and buy guns, and essentially were just walking them through the procedure of mounting a terrorist attack, and then arresting them. There's been a lot of criticism of that. So, take that with a grain of salt. On the other hand, I think that the United States has a much more integrated Muslim community. The United States historically has been a place for immigrants. I am an immigrant myself. I came from Romania when I was the age of 10. And I can say, as an immigrant that also lived in Europe, we lived in Germany and in Switzerland. America is the only place where I feel American, whereas we never felt Swiss, we never felt German. I'm not sure that my personal experience is necessarily relevant, but I do think that there is an element of integration that is sorely missing in places like France, where Muslims say that they feel like they're on the margins of society. Rose Sario is asking, where did you get this information so we all understand? Do you study the religion and these groups? So, Rose, I've been studying the jihadist ideology and these terrorist groups, I would say since 2012, and pretty much full-time since 2013. My initial introduction to it was, at that point in time, I was based in West Africa, in the country of Senegal, and in 2012, Al-Qaeda's North African branch took over half of northern Mali. And so that became my beat, because I was in the region, and that was kind of the biggest story that was happening there. They did in northern Mali very similar things to what we've seen ISIS do in Raqqa. They instituted a Sharia tribunal. They got rid of all of the symbols of the state. Women had to be veiled. And they ruled that place under Sharia law for almost a year, until January 2013, when the French went in and pushed them back. And I'm telling you this because at that point in time, I was trying to cover that story, and it was very frustrating for me because I couldn't go there. So I was, calling residents, kind of working on the edges of the story. And the breakthrough for me came in January of 2013, when I was able to get to the city of Timbuktu, which had just been liberated by the French. And I found thousands of pages of documents that the Al-Qaeda franchise had left behind. And I spent the next year translating those documents and learning about them. And I was really surprised at what I learned. I had the image that these people were, these very primitive people that were in caves somewhere. And instead, I'll just give you as one example. I ended up doing a story about a leading Al-Qaeda commander in Africa who was reprimanded by the organization for the crime of not having turned in his expense reports on time. So I suddenly learned this is an organization that has an accounting structure, and that just as I'm, after this Paris trip, I'm expected to turn in my expenses, he too was expected to turn in his. So that began my exploration of this group. And things have moved very quickly with ISIS. Back when I was covering Al Qaeda, the majority of their communication was still on these password protected forums that you couldn't really access unless you were a member of the group. That changed with ISIS with the explosion of their propaganda on Twitter and on an encrypted app that one has on one's phone, which is called Telegram. On Telegram, they now have public channels where they post information about attacks, etc. And it was on those channels that we learned about last night's stabbing of the police officer. It was on that channel that we learned that ISIS was taking credit for Orlando, for San Bernardino, etc. And so I monitor those channels very carefully. And then in addition, I have tried to nurture sources that are close to the terrorist group. And for a brief period, I was able to speak to a number of ISIS members. It's become increasingly hard now with the intensity of the airstrikes, but that also helped in deepening my understanding of them. Marissa is asking, why is ISIS attacking during holidays and celebrations? Is there any particular strategy behind that? And could they just be claiming to be behind the Orlando attacks to spread their name and the fear of it? Marissa, the thing I want you to understand is there's a misperception, I think, out there that ISIS claims anything and everything. I'll give you one example. Example number one, they've only claimed 2 attacks in America. The first one, which was at the Garland, Texas Community Center, they applauded it, but they didn't actually take credit for it. So really, it's 2 attacks in the time that ISIS has been around. It's not very many. A couple of weeks ago, you might recall that a flight, Egypt Air, mysteriously disappeared over the Mediterranean. Because the Russian jet over the Sinai had been claimed by ISIS, and because investigators have since come out and said that yes, they believe that terrorism was involved, everyone immediately assumed that Egypt Air must have been taken down by ISIS. They never claimed it. They could very easily have claimed that attack at a point in time when people were leaning towards believing that ISIS had done it, but they did not. And my reading of that is that they didn't claim it because they didn't do it. The other misconception is that Al Qaeda and ISIS claim each other's attacks. They don't. There's been one prominent counterexample that was an attack on a museum in Tunisia, the Bardo Museum, that was claimed both by a group close to Al Qaeda and by a group close to ISIS. That seems to be just about the only counterexample. So when you see ISIS taking credit, but be careful when you see ISIS officially taking credit. There's a lot of ISIS sympathizers out there that say various things on Twitter, and you have to be very careful to curate what is an official ISIS statement versus what is something that is being said by one of their fans. But generally, when you have an official ISIS statement, I tend to look at them very carefully, because the history has shown that they generally claim things that either they have done themselves or that somebody that was actively inspired by their propaganda has done. Axel Nordgaard is asking, do you believe attacks where the attacker pledges allegiance to ISIS before the attack will become more common, rather than ISIS planning and executing the attack? So in the West, there have been really only, I think, 3, I hope I'm not getting this wrong, but I think there's only been 3 attacks that were actually successfully carried out by ISIS operatives that were sent back by the core group from Syria. The first one was the attack on the Brussels Museum in 2014. The second one was Paris, November of last year. And then the third one was the Brussels airport and subway attack this year. So you need to keep in mind that attacks by ISIS in the West that are directly carried out by their operatives who trained in Syria are very few. There's been a lot more that have been attempted, but as far as successful ones, those are the only ones that I have counted. What is much more common is these smaller attacks by these people that we're calling lone wolves, I'm uncomfortable with that term because lone wolf implies that the person is completely alone. And counterterrorism officials will tell you that the only true lone wolf in the history of American terrorism was the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, who was, in his isolated place in the woods and who truly did not communicate with anybody else and came up with his crazy plan to attack all on his own. The ISIS lone wolves are at a minimum in touch with an online world. Okay, they're imbibing the ISIS propaganda through Telegram, through Twitter, through Facebook, by Google searches. So at a minimum, they're having that type of interaction. And then the majority of them, we have learned, are in touch with people on the periphery of the organization. We call them ISIS fanboys. That's at a minimum. And what we're learning is often what happens after these attacks is that law enforcement officials in the first hours and days after the attack occurs are not able to immediately find evidence of a deeper tie. And so they tell reporters and the world, we think this person was acting alone. We haven't seen any signs of a greater network. And the record tends to not be corrected when law enforcement officials come back and then append the record and say, actually, after 6 months of investigation, we have now found that Amadi Coulibaly, who led the Hyper Caché attack on a kosher supermarket, taking a supermarket hostage and killing several people, and who we told you was a lone wolf, actually we have now found evidence that he was in touch with somebody in Syria. That came out, I was first made aware of that attack was in January of 2015, and I was first made aware of the fact that he had been in touch with people in Syria after the November Paris attacks. So, months and months after it happened, the record is corrected. So anyway, I do think that you're going to see more of these so-called lone wolf attacks. And once again, the signature that I always look for is, did the person pledge allegiance to the leader of ISIS in some public forum before or during the attack? Kyle Van Fleet. Kyle Van Fleet is asking, is there a way to intervene between the spreading of radical propaganda from terrorist groups and those susceptible to being turned into lone wolves? Again, I think a really smart question. I worked for several weeks last year on a profile of a young woman from Washington State. An all-American girl who was born here, came actually from a Christian family, no immigrant roots of any kind, and was in fact a Sunday school teacher at her local church. So just to show you how far over into this other category she was. And she accidentally learned about ISIS after hearing about them on the news. She started to Google them and look for them on Twitter. She ended up starting to talk to them via Twitter direct message, and then via Skype and via Facebook and other apps. And in a period of 3 months, she went from being a Sunday school teacher to having converted to their version of extreme Islam, and was in the stages of discussing a possible trip to a Muslim land, which she understood to be Syria. So the radicalization, my point is, it happens very, very quickly. This young woman was really remarkable in that she was kind enough and open enough to really open up her life to me, and she allowed me to read back through her Twitter messages and tried to find, the moment when she veered off course. The one thing that kept her back, it was actually two things, I would say. One was her love of family, and families play a very important role in this because, of course, she is Googling these things, and so even though they're telling her you're going to come to the Islamic State and you're going to live in a protected place and you're going to join this kind of a utopia, she was able to, of course, realize that there is a counter narrative to that, and that she might get killed. So part of it was family. The other thing that helped her was the intervention of several people including a man called Mubin Sheikh, who is a former extremist himself. He's a Canadian man who is a Muslim and who, at one point in his youth, had veered into extremism and went so far as to travel to Asia to meet with the Taliban. Somehow, this young man pulled himself away from the edge, and returned to a normal life, and has now sort of made it his mission, to reach out to troubled young people, many of whom he interacts with on the internet. And I was able to see the interaction that he had with her, and that interaction was really seminal. And what Mubin was able to do, which is something that no law enforcement official in America, and really no person who's outside of this framework could do, is he said to her, he said, I've been there, okay? These arguments that you're saying about killing the infidel, I've imbibed them myself. I used to be there. Let me show you this verse from the Quran, which essentially contradicts what you're saying. Let me show you that verse from the Quran. And he deconstructs it by throwing the religion back in their face. And certain, I've always been curious as to why it is that our country hasn't yet done what other countries have done, which is to adopt these people, to adopt these former extremists, and use them in their counter-messaging strategy. I think it's not very useful to have a moderate Muslim imam preaching to these young people, because ISIS tells them these imams are also the kafir, they're also the infidels. It's much harder for them to argue against somebody like Mubin Sheikh, who went so far as to meet the Taliban. So that is one strategy that I've pondered, and that I've seen adopted in other places, and that might be interesting to adopt here as well. Sorry. Jonathan Cabell is asking, does it matter if we differentiate between actual ISIS credit or claimed ISIS credit? Jonathan, as I said earlier, when there haven't been cases where ISIS claimed credit for something, or let me say there have been very few cases where they claimed credit for something and they hadn't actually done it. So the two things very much start to blur together. I don't want to make too much of this. ISIS routinely embellishes the statistics and the details of what they've achieved. So in a claim of responsibility, you'll see that they'll say that they killed 100 people when they only killed 50. But the general skeleton of it, meaning one of our adherents is responsible for Orlando, generally tends to be true. Let's see. Yeah. And Andy Van DeMark, I think this is the last question I'll take because we're running out of time. And I thank you all for participating. Andy has a question about what makes an official ISIS statement official. Again, a very good question. ISIS has a series of official outlets, okay? These people that study ISIS know what they are. Among them is the Amaq news agency, which acts as a kind of news wire for ISIS. And in the past year, we've seen that Amaq is usually the first place where an attack will be claimed. In addition, there's a host of other official outlets. They have channels on this app called Telegram. Among them is Nashir English, Amaq, Khilafa News, and if you're subscribed to these channels, that the news that's coming out there or the statements that are coming out there, that they are authentic ISIS statements. And we know this because we've been watching them now for some time, and there's a pattern of truth to it. Beyond that, they have a radio station, Bayan, which has a daily news bulletin. And so whenever there's a major terrorist attack, one of the first things I do is to go look up the daily bulletin for that day and see, has ISIS, mentioned this? They're usually a day to 2 days behind. So for instance, the day of the Orlando attack, that daily bulletin came out, and ISIS, it led with something in Iraq or Syria. It had no mention of Orlando. By the next day, meaning yesterday, it was at the top of their news bulletin. And then beyond that, for the biggest attacks that they themselves have orchestrated, like Paris, they'll usually release a video, and the video isn't necessarily the same day or the same week even as the attacks, but it eventually comes out, and that video will sometimes have footage of the attackers before the attack, again pledging allegiance to the leader of ISIS, and that becomes, you know, even more an imprimatur of the group. So I thank you all. I'm really grateful for all of you who have joined us today, and follow me on Twitter at @rkalimaki is my ID, and I will be updating each day that I can what I'm learning about the terrorism beat. Take care now. Bye.